And I'm funny.
Looking.
That's fair.
Welcome back to
Hey.
the Studio Steele podcast. I'm your host, Hat.
I'm a decorative piece of furniture. Hair swoop.
It's a beautiful swoop.
Thank you.
Yesterday, you and I were talking
Yes.
at how surprised we were at what stage of the pandemic was time-wise.
We're almost at like a year.
Yeah.
Like that's like, I mean, I'm not surprised that we've got here. Like I kind of figured it was going to go on for a while. But we were like looking at like the calendars the next couple months, trying to figure out what's going on at the church, what's going on with the podcast.
Yeah.
And like we're getting to the point where we've been doing COVID for a year.
Yeah.
The podcast is almost a year old, kind of, give or take.
I wrote it down in the calendar. I was like, pandemic turns 1.
Yeah, it's like March, like 14th or something.
Yeah, like the 10th or something like that in March. So what we were wondering this week is, we got some vaccines rolling out. There's going to be some time yet before this pandemic is over, but there's things in place that are going to end it.
Yeah.
Right. So what is your most anticipated post-pandemic activity?
Okay. I'm a strange human. Because like a lot of people are like,
tell us something we don't know.
That's fair. But like I'm like those people that really enjoy like escape rooms and like board game cafes and like game kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And like that was like the go-to date night with like my fiance now.
What's her name?
Her name's Hannah. I was gonna be like, I'm gonna avoid saying names, but like it doesn't really matter. Like that was our go-to like activities. We would go to like a board game cafe and just like spend hours there, and like it's cheap, it's fun, we're able to do stuff.
It is inexpensive.
So like I'm really excited to be able to like do those again. And like I know like there was a point in time like mid-pandemic where like escape rooms opened up for like a little bit,
like a blip
in
the
but like
pandemic.
even that was kind of weird because like you were in the escape room with like masks on, like some required gloves, but everyone kind of recovered. Like it was a different feel. Like everyone was kind of like it was a different vibe. So I'm
like the
I'm
pandemic
excited.
followed you into that. Like you weren't escaping the pandemic.
Yeah.
Like you weren't escaping anything.
Which would be a really good escape room now that you come to get to it. Could you imagine just like an escape the pandemic theme one? That'd be fun.
$1 billion idea.
I think so.
Right there.
So that's my
copyrighted
answer, is like escape rooms, board game cafes, like those kind of like millennial-y, hipstery, like is that where it's at now? Like I know there was a point when like board game cafes were like just becoming a thing, and it was like it's such a hipstery thing. Is that still a thing? I don't know.
I don't know. You tell us.
Yeah, tell. Am I getting old now?
Yeah.
Probably. I mean, probably.
One of the things that we used to do with Matthew was like bring him to like the public pool or something like that, and just sort of he has this little like swimming belt. It's like water wings and a belt, and so he could just kind of like safely like paddle around and stuff. And so we loved just kind of like bringing him there, going down the water slide, having fun.
Nice.
I'd hit up like the steam room. It was like totally relaxing, and again like same thing. Like they opened it up kind of like really briefly, but you were still kind of like, I don't know. Is this
Can I go there?
really
Should I go there? Yeah.
So that was kind of another one of those blips. So I'm looking forward to kind of like just taking the family out and doing swimming. Like, and it was a great like winter activity too.
Yeah. It's warm.
So
like, escape the cold for a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Wish you could escape the cold now.
But what about you guys? Like, what are you looking forward to kind of like getting back to doing? Like, what activity?
Yeah.
Like there's always kind of like the like hanging out with people, having people over for dinners, and so like that would be on my list too. But like, what are you guys? What are you guys looking forward to? Let us know in the comments below. Yeah, because I guess like technically like right now, even though we're here. In the video, we're also up above the comment section, so the comments are below.
Thank you. I was wondering how YouTube worked.
This has been my tutorial on how YouTube works. So,
what is this podcast?
We have been continuing to look at D6 in our online small groups. And a little while ago, we were looking at stories in the Gospel of Luke.
Yes.
We came across like Luke 10, and within that one is the story of the Good Samaritan.
Yeah.
And I guess like the idea is like the idea that kind of like permeates through that section is like what is a good neighbor, right? And of course, like through the course of our discussions, we were kind of looking at like, well, what does it mean to be a good neighbor today?
Yeah.
Right.
Because like the context of where we're at is very different than, well, first of all, the context of what was being said back when the parable came out, but even more so now because we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and it's much more difficult to be a good neighbor when you're kind of isolated, kind of distanced out from people. But like when we were thinking about it, we were talking about like what the current context looks like. Even though it's more extreme now with this like isolation, we were talking about how we feel like even without COVID, without the pandemic, we still like society today is very individualistic. It's kind of still in this like you're in your bubble, whether that be COVID or whether that just be like day-to-day life, where most people don't know their neighbors. Yeah.
Conservative or liberal or
like everyone's kind of in their little bubble.
Or Christian or atheist or college or studied and learned or trades or just like whatever. It's just like we have like managed to kind of like isolate ourselves and like put ourselves into like individual pockets, right? And I think that's also kind of like extended ourselves to sort of like me, myself, and I, right? And I think one of the things that I believe that the pandemic has done is kind of like expose the cracks in that individualism. And I was sort of kind of shocked to see like some of the like responses to pandemic measures, right? Like wearing masks or like the government decisions to like keep us distance or something like that, and it's like these measures, they might not be perfect, but they do have the intention of like trying to look out for the kind of like the utmost safety, right? And then you would hear these like rallying cries like you can't force this on me, and and I was kind of sort of shocked that we couldn't kind of rise to these measures to look kind of like beyond what they would do for other people, in helping to limit the spread of COVID-19 especially. But so like it's almost like we've all kind of heard this phrase from like the Three Musketeers. It's like all for one and one for all, right? And it's almost like we've like kind of like shifted that and it's a great phrase, right? It's like sort of this like communal care, and especially like in a group, they were kind of this military kind of policing force where they were kind of looking out for each other. They had each other's backs, right? It's sort of like we don't have each other's backs anymore, right? It's sort of like the phrase could almost be like all for themselves and themselves for no one else, right? And it's kind of sad. And so that's kind of the landscape that we find ourselves in, right? And so we're going to look at how Luke 10 can address some of those issues.
Yeah. It's actually kind of funny. I was thinking through it, like the story of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10. It's one of those stories that I think most people have probably heard of. Like it's one of the more popular parables that Jesus had talked about. It's one of those like it's talked about in most Sunday school classrooms. Like it's not this more obscure like story. And I have to laugh. Like the first time that I had ever heard it was in a VeggieTales video.
Totally.
I remember this fondly of the story of Flibberaloo with the two like tribes of people, one that has like the pots on their head and one that has like the shoes on their head.
Okay.
It was fantastic. But like that was the story that I grew up like knowing. That's the one like, oh yeah, this is fun to watch. Cartoon vegetables doing things. But like it's the exact story of Luke 10. And if you look at it, it starts with a question of like, what is the greatest command that we're supposed to follow?
Yeah, and so we have this kind of like this dialogue and exchange between Jesus and a law expert, And so throughout their exchange, kind of the two laws that come up, and the first one is from Deuteronomy 6 verse 5, and it's love the Lord your God with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your heart and all your mind. Basically, like love God with everything that you have, right? And then the other one that goes along with it comes from Leviticus 19 verse 8, and it's love your neighbor as yourself, right? So this is in kind of the Old Testament, and Jesus is like, okay, like do those things, and you're looking pretty good. And then the guy is kind of like, well, who's my neighbor? And he's kind of asking like where, like, what are the boundaries of my love? Like, who can I exclude from my love? Like, to what extent does that go to? Right? And that's kind of the question, and that's when Jesus launches into this Good Samaritan parable, right? And so a guy gets beaten and left for dead. A couple workers in the temple walk by, and because they didn't want to inconvenience themselves with like the requirements of the law, they chose not to help this person and put their convenience over helping this person. And then Jesus introduces a third character, a Samaritan, who ends up restoring this robbed, half-dead man. And this is the shocking part of the story, because you would almost expect the first two to have helped, or at least they would have understand why they didn't, right? And the last person was sort of like a cultural enemy of the people of Israel, right? Samaritans and Jews just had this tension between themselves. And you can read a little bit more about that tension in John 4, where Jesus talked to a Samaritan woman, and they talk about their differences, right? But there's sort of this enmity between them. And that's kind of the shocking part of this story, right? Is that the person who is your neighbor, or the person that you show love to, it is the person that you might not necessarily even agree with, right? And Jesus goes on, even in like the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount, right? Talks about like loving your enemies, right? So actually, so to answer the question, like where are the boundaries? Like where does my love extend to? Who do I show that to? The answer is everybody,
right?
And that's kind of what Jesus is getting at in that parable. So we are going to take a look at how like some of the things that we can do to help us love our neighbors as we look at this, go through this parable.
Yeah. So
Ryan, there's three things that we kind of like chose to focus on. There's probably a lot more that you could focus on, but what's the first thing that we wanted to look at in terms of this story and how to love our neighbors?
Well, the first thing we looked at was we kind of, when we were making these three different points, we kind of based it off of what Jesus himself said to the answer of the question. And the first thing that he said, with being the greatest of the commands, is to love the Lord your God. And I think that is central to how you are able to be a good neighbor, if that makes sense. It's this thought of, because this is the greatest command that we're supposed to follow. If you draw close to God, if you learn to love him, that's going to lead to you living a godly life, having godly ideals. And by having that, it will start you on that path to have a neighbor-centered focus. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because sin separated our connection from God, right? And so once you start kind of restoring that connection, the good things that God wants out of life, and how you can live within that, right? And so you start to work on that connection with God, and then everything kind of flows out of that, right? And when I was thinking about this point, I got to thinking about Galatians 5. I think it's verse 16. It says, "So I say, walk in the Spirit, and you'll not gratify the desires of the sinful nature, or the desires of the flesh, or, like all the things that like break down our relationships with other people, ourselves, and all of our connections. You're not going to want to destroy those, because you're walking with God, and you're learning from God. You're soaking that in. And so, yeah, like as you just grow closer to God, God's desires are just going to come out of you, right? And into the world around you, and into the relationships, and into, your neighbor connections. And it's just going to permeate all of those.
Yeah. And we were saying that once that happens, once you're starting by growing and learning to love God, the next thing that you need to focus on is learning how to truly care about people. We talk about this as like compassion is kind of like our one word that we kept it to, but it's central. If you want to be a good neighbor, you have to actually care about people. And now that, like, this doesn't mean you need to be this like super extrovert that you just have to like be with people all the time and that has to fill you. But you do need to learn to see people and learn to see through their eyes, learn to see where they're coming from, and be able to prioritize people over top of like any issues that may be separating you from.
Yeah.
That's English. Kind of ish. Words are hard.
We'll do the next podcast in numbers, but
that's a good one.
Yeah, it's like, when we look at this parable and Jesus is telling the story, and the Samaritan comes across the half-dead robbed man, and within that story it says that Samaritan had compassion on him, right? Like he had needs that needed to be met in order to stay alive,
right?
And his compassion drove him to care about that. It wasn't like imagining like, he'll just get better, right? Like he imagined himself in that person's shoes, understood what his needs were. It's like this person needs someone to care for him, right? And so, yeah, like I love that idea of like understanding where people are coming from. That's kind of like a great way to kind of ground yourself in compassion. But yeah, kind of like the other aspect is like, when you do that, you kind of start to imagine like what needs need to be met in this person that maybe they're not meeting on their own. And that just kind of like breaks down division, right? And so we're almost sort of like a society that's like characterized by our divisions, right? And the compassion like breaks those down, right? It kind of asks the question like, how can I care for this person? Right. And
sometimes like that caring, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're just going to be supporting whatever the person's wanting to do, because there are some areas where you might have a friend who is going down a path that isn't healthy for them. Caring about that person isn't just, oh, you're doing great and I support that. Caring can sometimes mean like telling people the harsh truths.
It's tough love,
and that tough love mentality. I think that's also something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I find that interesting because like when as I hear you saying that too, it's right. We've talked before about sort of making sure that scripture is kind of always before you, right? And like a lot of times there are things in our lives that don't line up with that, right? And one of the ultimate needs in our lives is to kind of like put our lives on track with what scripture is telling us, right? And so when somebody's life is kind of off that track, one of the needs that they have is to be brought back in line with God's laws, right? Like the ways that we're going to thrive in life. So and of course this compassionate view comes from the position that God views all of us, right? Scripture talks about our like the way that we have lived, and the way that God wants us to live. It's sort of like an enmity, right? And yet God transcends that to give us his grace, right? And it's not just like some people needed God's grace and other people didn't because they were okay. It was like across the board, like humanity has needed God's grace, right? And so this parable is very telling of like two people who were at conflict with each other through no fault of their own other than their culture, right? And what they believed, and sort of like, here's how you're supposed to view people, like meet people's needs, like have compassion for them, right? And God met our need for grace across the board, right? And so if God has that view of all of us, then why should we not adopt that view and share in that viewpoint and have that compassionate viewpoint towards every other single person, right? And so I don't think we talked about this yet too, but just briefly, like some ideas for who your neighbor might be, right? Some of you are in school settings, and of course that has its own sort of like popularity dynamics and stuff like that. Sort of like, so who in your school could you be compassionate towards, right? Like in my context, I live in a neighborhood. I'm a homeowner, and I'm invested in my neighborhood, right? And so I want to see like all of my neighbors like thrive, like no matter who they are, right? So like what does that look like for you? Like who could you be compassionate towards?
I think one of the biggest impacts of this parable in and of itself is that because the Samaritan and the main person of the story are so distinct, it really hits home that like everyone is your neighbor. And like I think it's really important to first like look around in your context and see who in this circle is there, who in that circle, who in that circle. But I think even more than that, it's important to have this way of living that it doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter if you know them. It doesn't matter if you have any way, like any connection, if they go to your school, if they play on the same team, if they like anything. I think it's this loving people is greater than whatever.
The things that divide us, right? The ideas and mentalities that divide us. We had talked earlier about these kind of cultural landscape aspects, and again, through no fault of anybody's, right? Like there's this global pandemic going on, which has isolated us, some more than others, but like a great way to show compassion and be neighborly during this time. Like reach out to people, like ask them how they're doing, and just like think about people that you would have normally connected maybe at youth group or in your church family, and just sort of like, oh, like, hey, I should just like send them a text, message them on Discord, or send them a TikTok video. I don't know, right? Like just like get the word out and just kind of see how people are doing. Like just open up your ears, like be a someone to listen to, and just like inquire how people are going. It's a great way to be neighborly. A great way to be compassionate too.
So the first one of things to do is, first of all, love God. Second one, look for ways to be compassionate, have this lifestyle. The third thing that we wanted to hit on was this idea that you need to be prepared to sacrifice in this, because a lot of the time, having this compassion, being a good neighbor, it's not easy. It's not often just this ideal situation where it happens. Like you look at the story of the Samaritan themselves. They had to give up a lot in order to be able to help out this person. And the same thing applies. Yeah,
definitely. Like we look at this story and kind of like the first thing, like you might need to be prepared to give up your time, right? Like the Samaritan clearly had like an agenda, right? Like it wasn't just sort of like dawdling on the road, right? This person was traveling, like going from one place to another, because they, maybe they had it in their Samaritan daytimer. I don't know what that looks like, right? But they had a plan, and they had to kind of totally like reroute themselves to like help this person out. Like in the story, the Samaritan like actually stays with them for a night in the hotel that they rented. And then had to like come back and to like check up on that person, and then further, like if there were any kind of further costs incurred, like had to pay that, right? So it might cost you your time, and that's a precious thing to a lot of people. Time, in the words of Linkin Park, time is a valuable thing. Watch it fly by as the pendulum. So people don't know Linkin Park anymore. What am I talking about? So like it is valuable, right? Like I know, like I value my time, the time that I spend with my family, the time that I spend like caring for myself, that whole like self-care thing. But in order to be a good neighbor and to love your neighbor, like it might just sort of like cost you that in order to like invest in someone else, right?
I think also hit on the second part is like it might also cost you money or
Right.
resources or whatever. You look at the story of the Samaritan. He stayed with him, but he also paid for those fees. He paid to make sure that this man's going to be okay.
Yeah.
Now, this probably isn't going to be like a direct one-to-one comparison to what this looks like for all of us. You're probably not just finding some random person lying on the street and
let me book you a hotel, right? Like, yeah.
But like the same principle applies. Is this could cost you resources. This could cost you money. This could cost you food. Like I think it's actually a privilege that I have living in Edmonton. I live in like the Westwood area, which if you don't know is kind of like lots of people refer to it as a sketchy area. It's the best way I can describe it. There's been many times that I've been approached by many a homeless person or many someone who's down, a person who's down on their luck and is just looking for food, looking for ways to help. And there are times where you may be inclined or be willing to buy them a meal. And I have multiple times, but that isn't just from like, oh, good thing that I found this $10 bill on the side of the road that I can then give to you. It's, you might have to be willing to use your own personal resources to help somebody who needs help.
Yeah, whatever that looks like, right? Like, not everyone has kind of like the fattest stacks or the biggest piggy bank, right? But that's not the point. It's kind of like what you use and do to kind of like sacrifice for the other person, to put the other person's needs above their own, to care for other people, right? And so maybe that's food or clothing, donations and stuff like that. Sort of like think about like what are people's needs, how can you meet them, and in doing that you're going to be showing love for your neighbor, right? So kind of like the last one that was kind of going through my mind in this is like the sacrifice to your pride, right? So here are two people that are experience cultural tension, right, because of their ideas, right? And we definitely live in a time where our ideas can separate us and divide us, and it's just like increasing like more and more so every day, right? So don't let those divisions stop you from extending love to people, right? The Jews and the Samaritans hated each other. Like, this is like historical fact, right? And yet in this story that Jesus is telling, and it wasn't just a story that Jesus told, like, because if we look at John 4, he actually lived that out too, right? In his conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well, right? So yeah, like despite those divisions, like there was help and care and concern and compassion, right? And love. So I don't know what that looks, well, I can think of some ideas of what that looks like today, right? Like especially in the pandemic, I've kind of been like toying around this idea in my head, and I'm just going to throw it out there, but it's like I'm never more free than when I take up the concerns and care of another person. And that might come at the expense of my freedom, but I'm never more free than when I do this. And I'm kind of drawing on the example of the God of the universe, for starters, right? Who is bound by nothing, really, right? And yet he chose to confine himself to the limitations of a human being, and then die humiliatingly for the sake of other people, right? And like these could be some like just differences in idea. Like that's a hit to the pride, right? For God, right? And the opposite of pride, I think, is humility. And so you can read about that in Philippians 2, and Paul talks about Christ's humility. And so yeah, I think there's a lot of talk nowadays about sort of like placing like your freedom above everything else, right? But I kind of push back on the idea of that and say I'm never more free than when I think about someone else, right? And that might mean kind of like upending my ideas of what I think I'm entitled to.
Makes sense.
So that could be a hit to your pride, right? Or your ideology, or the differences in ideas and opinions, right? That's just what I think about when I think about sort of like if you're going to be loving and be neighborly, like a lot of times suspending our ideals for the sake of somebody else so that we can meet somebody else's needs could be a hit to your ideological pride.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well,
there's some ideas to think about. Maybe you have a story yourself about, a time that you showed this neighborly love and you want to share it in the comments, just to encourage other people about, how we can do that as well. It'd be great to hear from you guys in the comments, and you can always subscribe to it so that you get these, the latest podcasts. You could like it. Just because it makes us feel good. Yeah. Exactly. I don't know if that does anything algorithmically.
I have no idea how it must. You're the one that was explaining how YouTube works.
Oh, yeah.
You should know this.
I'm the professional.
Yeah.
Alphabetically.
Sure.
Emphatically.
Yeah, okay.
Categorically.
Yeah.
Is that it? Is that all we got?
I think so.
Okay. We've exhausted our knowledge for this week. Tune in next week when we've...
Not next week. 2 weeks from now.
Next time.
There you
go. And maybe we'll have thunked some more.
We'll see.
About some things. Thanks for tuning in, guys. We'll see you in 2.
Like target people that you shouldn't be doing anything like that. But like, if you have a really terrible pun that you know nobody's ever going to appreciate, but you think it's hilarious, say it.
I stopped listening to that pretty much at the beginning of that whole soliloquy because I realized that we forgot to do the clap sync.
I'm here giving these really important messages, encouraging humor and encouraging laughter in such a sad pandemic time that we currently are existing in. And you're just not listening to me. And it's fine because I've grown used to it.
At least I'm consistent.
Yeah.